So look, the last year has obviously been really challenging for everyone. And I think in marketing, we're probably all dizzy from the number of pivots that we've had to make. Digital marketing is very much at the forefront of everything we're doing at the moment. And I'm sure it's the same for everyone. And that's meant a lot more data, a lot more systems, and a lot more risk. So although we've got a mix of experience levels on the call, this is primarily aimed at marketing people. So we're going to try and make it as practical as we possibly can. And I'm extremely lucky this morning to be joined by one of our top lawyers in this area, John Farrell. So John, thanks so much for taking the time today. I know.
Thanks, Natalie. Good to be here.
There's a lot going on in your house. You've got electricians and dogs, so we'll and pray for the best. So John, just to get us all started, there's a lot of kind of jargon and there's a lot of different things going on. So from a data privacy and protection, what are the ground rules? What are the things we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so I suppose, look, as a general point, I mean, GDPR wasn't just something we all sort of had to spend a few months worrying about in 2018. It's definitely here to stay, and it's getting more complex. We're seeing constant guidance coming out from regulators. We're seeing lots of cases at an EU level, and that's really because it's the area that touches on things like ad tech and social media. So we're seeing lots of concepts and updated guidance constantly. And I suppose you guys in the marketing industry are definitely at the coalface in terms of compliance within an organization, particularly if it's not a data-driven organization, because I suppose you guys tend to have that sort of interaction with a lot of that information. And I suppose if the GDPR wasn't doom and gloom enough to start with, the EU member states are starting to gather pace over the last couple of weeks on a new e-privacy regulation, and we'll come to that in a little bit more detail later on. But e-privacy rules and GDPR rules sort of run tandem, and particularly in the marketing sphere, they overlap a lot. So you really need to take both into account. So I suppose the first thing I would say for someone in the marketing function is to have a good understanding of your organization's role from a data protection standpoint. And I suppose whether you're a controller or a processor, I suppose, is the most fundamental issue. So a controller is the entity basically making the decisions about the data and I suppose determining the purposes for which it's used. So typically, if you're in the marketing team in a company and you're dealing with your customer databases, etc., then your company is going to be the controller of that information because you're the decision maker. The other concept is a processor, and that's basically where you're doing something with information on behalf of someone else and under their instruction. So I suppose a classic example would be some sort of supplier or service provider. So something like marketing agencies, SMS service providers, etc. They'll typically fall into that category. There's lots of weird arrangements can come up, things like joint controller and stuff, probably for another day. But one area that might arise in practice is if you're in a sort of a larger multinational group, you might have shared marketing or shared IT functions, and it could mean that one entity within the group is acting as a processor on behalf of others. So you just need to watch out for that as well.
Okay, and if I'm looking at the difference practically between a controller and a processor, what do I need to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I suppose controllers have much more obligations from a data protection standpoint, and ultimately they're responsible for ensuring compliance with all of the GDPR principles. Processors will also have general responsibilities, but most of their obligations tend to be set out in the contract that they have in place with the controller. So that could be if you have a terms and conditions or a services agreement, it could be part of that, or it could be a standalone DPA or data processing agreement. Sometimes you'll see that. A lot of the bigger providers will have just that standalone data protection agreement. So that kind of sets out the processor obligations.
Now, looking at our poll, I think 67% of people on the call are data controllers. And I know certainly myself that that's our position. From the point of view of, as a controller, the data that I'm collecting, the data that I'm managing, what do I need to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I suppose once you kind of know where you are in the ecosystem, the next point is make sure you do have a good understanding of the type of information you're collecting or using about your customers. And I suppose in particular, watch out for anything that might fall into what's called the special category data, as that has a higher level of protection. So this includes things like medical information or religious beliefs, and it can really easily inadvertently get collected. You know, take some practical examples, something like dietary preferences. If you're running an event, you know, somebody tells you that they're celiac, or that they don't want a main course if it's pork for religious beliefs. That's examples of information that is special category data. You know, another example could be, you know, where you're running events tied to religious events, something like Diwali events, things like that. You just have to be careful that you don't collect too much information that you could sort of infer or you know, reasonably guess at a person's religious beliefs around that. And I suppose in my experience, what's a real pitfall for this type of thing is free text boxes in CRM systems or in marketing systems, because that sort of encourages people to write in every bit of information they know about a person. And that's where you, if you're not being really careful, that's where you can collect some of that information, because, you know, it might be useful down the line, but it just, you need to remember it has that higher threshold.
Well, I suppose, you know, the inclination is to kind of collect as much as you can and then hang on to it for as long as you can. So is there kind of any rules around how long is too long?
Yeah, it's the classic Irish scenario. You know, I'll hold on to that because it might be useful down the line for something. So I suppose there are kind of three main concepts here, and they're kind of pillar concepts in GDPR. So it's data retention, which you mentioned. That's, you know, how long do I keep it? Data minimization. Am I collecting too much information? And data accuracy is my information out of date, or is it accurate? So as I said, they're sort of pillar concepts, and if you don't sort of stitch them into what you're doing with your marketing database, it can actually start to contaminate your entire thing, because suddenly you're just not really able to stand over it and say, yes, we've really good procedures over the whole database. You know, if a lot of your information is out of date, then it kind of calls in other principles as well. So I suppose just to go back to the specific retention point, because I know it's one that people struggle a lot with, and to give a really lawyer answer, it'll kind of depend. You know, the general rule is you can only hold it for as long as is necessary for the purpose for which you collected it. So if you're collecting information for marketing purposes, and, you know, your person is opting into it, or saying, yes, I do want to receive marketing communications, then as long as that purpose remains, you can continue to hold it. So obviously, if the person unsubscribes or whatever the case may be, that's the time that you should probably get rid of it, unless you need it for a different purpose and you have a valid basis for that. And what I'd say is that the data accuracy point really ties into that as well, and it is important. So, you know, data cleansing exercises on databases should be carried out fairly regularly, because that'll help you with the retention point, and you're picking up things like bounce backs and you know, incorrect email addresses and things like that.
I mean, on the database over the last year, we've had a lot more activity, and we've had a lot more coming in, a lot more people coming into our database. So that's brought the whole issue of consents to the front again. Obviously, we did a big exercise around GDPR, but from a B2C point of view, because I'm conscious we have both on the call, what's the key things around data consent?
Yeah, so I suppose the very first thing to say about consents and the marketing rules is that because that primarily, particularly on the electronic marketing, is derived from the e-privacy rules I mentioned earlier on. So it's sort of a tandem piece of legislation to GDPR. That was implemented at an EU level via directive, which meant that the different EU countries had much more discretion of how they actually put it into practice. Now, they're talking about a regulation, and that will be coming soon, which it'll kind of take more of a GDPR approach, which means it's a bit more harmonized. But you just need to bear that in mind, particularly if you're running any sort of pan-European marketing campaign or anything like that, because some countries have much higher standard than you might be used to in Ireland. So if you take Germany, just as a really simple example, they pretty much operate a double opt-in, which means that the person not only has to effectively sign up for the marketing, but then you need to go and confirm the sign up a second time. So it's a really, really high bar. And just to explain, I suppose, for a second, the opt-ins and opt-outs, I'm just conscious I've used them a couple of times. If you think of the you know, any sort of common form, and this is the two tick boxes at the end, you know, so the opt-in is where you say something like, you know, if you would like to hear about our products and services in the future, please tick this box. So it's a sort of an active thing. You're collecting the the person is saying, yes, I do want to hear from you. The opt-out is where you might have the box and it could say something like, you know, we may contact you from time to time with products or services we think might be of interest to you. Please tick this box if you would not like to hear from us. So, you know, obviously from the human inertia standpoint, opt-outs are better, but it's a kind of a higher standard applied to them. And so I suppose kind of taking that and applying it in the scenario you mentioned, which is, I guess, the most common one, which is just B2C marketing done by electronic means. So it's, you know, text messages, emails. You know, the general rule in Ireland is that this needs to be done on an opt-in basis. So you need that active, yes, I do want you to contact me for marketing reasons. Now there is an exception. It's called the customer exception. So that's basically where you're marketing to an existing customer. So that's someone who you've sold a product to or a service in the past 12 months, or you've used their details for marketing in the past 12 months. You're marketing the product or service that's your own. So you know, you're not basing it off a third party's database, and that you're marketing a similar product to what you sold to them at the time you collected their information. So if you fit within all those criteria, you can market to those customers on an opt-out basis. So obviously that's good. It sets the bar lower. A lot of people still just default on the opt-in. It's safer, and you sort of don't have to watch these timelines of the 12 months and is it a similar product and all those type of things. So both are valid options. But I guess some will just go with that opt-in because it's just a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah, and I think when you're dealing with data, you know, safe is better than sorry. But for someone like us, we're in professional services, so all of our marketing is B2B. Is that any different, or is the same rules apply?
Yeah, so it's a little bit more, I guess, relaxed on a B2B perspective. So that can be generally done on an opt-out basis. So as long as you're giving people the opportunity to opt out, you can generally do it on that basis. Slightly trickier rules when you get into telephone calls, and it differs between mobile phone calls and landline calls. Probably for another day, but generally B2B marketing, certainly by emails and text messages, for example. You can do that on an opt-out basis. The one word of caution I would have on that is just to make sure if you deal with a lot of sole traders or small businesses, just be conscious that sometimes they can be using personal information. So, you know, it might be their own personal email address or their personal phone number as opposed to their professional email. So the default for dealing with those is effectively treat them as B2C rather than B2B. So unless you're really sure that this is a professional context, you know, jfarrell@mhc.ie, then that's, if it's a Gmail or something like that, you should probably default to the B2C rules just to be safe, unless you can be, you know, verify it and be sure.
Yeah, and I know some people do use personal emails just for firewall issues as well. So it can be a risk on the database. So it's a good point. Over the last 12 months for us, we've actually onboarded a lot of new systems, and you know that because you've had to do the contract negotiations for us. But a couple of things have cropped up when dealing with those third parties, which were a little bit different than ones we've done before. So if people are kind of dealing with new suppliers or getting new software, what are the things that they should be checking on those agreements?
Yeah, so it's the topic probably has you guys on the marketing team pulling your hair out when you come to me, and I'm just all about where is the data going, international data transfers. I think that's probably the biggest one. It's such a hot topic issue in the data protection world at the moment. There was a big European case last year called the Schrems case, which effectively struck down one of the mechanics that allowed for data transfers to the US called Privacy Shield, and the other main one called Standard Contractual Clauses took a bit of a bruising. So in essence, what the GDPR says is that anytime data leaves the EU and goes to a country that doesn't have adequate safeguards in place, it creates a risk for the rights of the individuals involved. So as a result, you need to have additional protections in place. And as I said, Privacy Shield was a commonly used one for the US. That's gone now. standard contractual clause is still there, but just a higher standard. So standard contractual clauses are essentially a sort of a template contracts that the EU have created. So you just put them in place. You're not allowed to change their form, so they just get signed pretty much. The reason I'm saying that they took a bit of a bruising is that the sort of overall question of data transfers to the US is still there. And what the regulators and the guidance coming out very much, and this came out from the cases as well, it's not just enough now to say, okay, we're engaging this new supplier and they're based in the US. We need these standard contractual clauses. Let's just download a copy, we'll sign them and stick it in the bottom drawer and never worry about it again. It's more about making sure that there is actually adequate protection, and I guess that the supplier can stand over what it's saying in the standard contractual clauses, the security commitments. And obviously when you're talking about data transfers to some countries, that's difficult because, you know, things like surveillance laws and stuff like that. So I would say at an early stage, try and ask the questions if you're thinking about getting a new supplier around data and what do they do with it. You know, ask them, can they guarantee that the data will stay within the EU? You know, is there any circumstances where it might be transferred outside the EU? It's not, you know, absolute dead in the water if they do transfer it. There may be ways around it, but it just is getting more difficult. And I think a lot of the technology suppliers and other companies, they're starting to create product offerings to address this and having options to like geolocate data in the EU, for example. So definitely do ask the question in the early stage. It's better just to deal with it then rather than kind of go down the road a bit. And you know, you spend a lot of time and effort and you're ready to go with a new system, and then suddenly this issue kind of rears its head.
I know at the end of last year, one big red flag that we had was around Brexit and data being stored in the UK, but I think that's been solved.
Yeah, so I suppose we were definitely on the cliff edge a couple of times in all aspects of Brexit, I suppose, but thankfully the data point is pretty much resolved. So the UK will almost certainly be getting deemed as an adequate country from a data protection standpoint. So that means that it won't really interrupt the flow. So it's not being treated as like an India or the US. It's equivalent to like a European Economic Area country, or sorry, like an adequate country in terms of data flow. So you have that kind of free flow of information without needing things like standard contractual clauses. Perfect.
Okay, a little bit of good news. And obviously, because we're all working from home and the pace and the intensity is a lot more, it does unfortunately increase the chance of a data breach. So the DPC just published their report, the Data Protection Commissioner. What's their kind of tone or what's their perspective at the moment on data breaches?
Yeah, so I suppose, look, unfortunately, data breaches are just a way of life. You know, that sort of wrongly sent email, it happens to everybody at some stage. And I think certainly my perspective is if clients tell me they never suffer a data breach, I kind of start to wonder about what policies and procedures they have in place, because I think you probably are suffering breaches, but if you're not picking them up, that's a different issue. So you mentioned the DPC report for last year, for 2020, which was released last week. They reported that there was over 6,600 valid data security breach received by them. So when you think about it, that's a huge number that's happening, because you have to take into account all the ones that don't get reported. So I think, I mean, look, the biggest thing to figure out, and this has kind of really come true in the regulator guidance, you have to act quickly. So you have an exceptionally short time frame to notify these things to the regulator. It's only 72 hours. So you really don't have time if something goes wrong to sort of try and figure it out as you go along, because the 72 hours will just be gone in an instant. The bar is, if you read GDPR, set pretty low for notifications to a regulator. So it's triggered if the breach is likely to cause a risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. Now, through the helpful guidance and things like that, we kind of, there's some general rules and risk analysis and things that can be applied. So what I'd say is in most instances, it's not reportable for those kind of common scenarios of, I just emailed the wrong person, the wrong spreadsheet, and it's, you know, you're dealing with low numbers of people. So that's your first question, is like the notification to the regulator. The second one is you need to tell the individuals. So it's a slightly higher bar. It's the notification to the individuals needs to happen where there's a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the people who are affected. So this was a good rule of thumb on that I sometimes use is, look, is the information involved something which could heighten their risk of identity theft, for example? So, you know, things like PPS numbers, bank account details, credit card information, things like that. Or is there that special category type data that I mentioned earlier on? So things like health information, sexual orientation, religious belief, things like that. And then obviously the numbers involved will heighten the risk as well. So, you know, email addresses and names of 2 or 3 people, probably really low risk. But if you multiply that by, you know, 1,000 or 10,000, suddenly it kind of amplifies it up. So I think takeaway is good news. Most breaches tend not to be reportable, but it's really important that they're identified and considered. And because even if it's not reportable to GPC, you're still expected to record it internally and record the reasons why you decided it wasn't reportable.
And I know that you mentioned, there's a lot there, but I know you mentioned the dreaded send, and you've pressed send, you've just realized it's gone to the wrong person, it had an Excel attached. So after you get over the initial heart attack, what do you do?
Yeah, I think we've all been there at some stage or another with Outlook's helpful, in inverted commas, emails suggested recipients. So I think, look, the first thing to do is just gather your breath, take a couple of minutes and just figure out what's actually happened, because sometimes the default is to start sending emails and doing other things, and sometimes you can just make it worse. So just, you know, gather your thoughts and figure out what's actually happened. I think as a very sort of initial thing you could do, you know, try and recall the email. It's not a great function in Outlook, in fairness, but, you know, it's better than nothing. And depending on, you know, in that scenario, the email to the wrong recipient, it may be a case that you could actually, you know, send them an email or pick up the phone to them if you know them and say, hey, I sent you an email with an attachment in error, you know, could you do me a favor and delete it, and just send me an email back just to say you've actually deleted it. So obviously that'll be only practical where there might be only a couple of recipients as opposed to a large number, but that's a really good practical step that you could do. I suppose the next thing to figure out is what information was actually captured in the breach and how many individuals were affected. So I think once you've gathered that information and try and gather it pretty quickly, then you're off to consult your internal breach notification policy to see who you need to tell internally. So if you haven't seen this type of policy before, I would definitely say go and dig it out, have a quick read through it. A really good policy will be really straightforward. It'll have good information and clear flow charts of, I guess, what needs to be done and, more importantly, by whom. If you can't find it, then I'd be raising it with the powers that be internally. You know, it's really crucial to have that policy in place, and there really isn't time, as I said, to try and figure it out once a breach has happened. And I suppose the last point on this I'd make is definitely don't delay on an internal notification due to fear or embarrassment. As I said, like, these things happen all the time, and the quicker that they're identified by the right people within the organization, the more time there is to try and mitigate it, and actually reduce the likelihood of potentially needing to report it to the DPC at all. And I suppose delay, that was something that came through from the DPC report, that some of the fines and decisions they've issued recently, they always pointed to delays in reporting as well. So they treat that 72-hour window as it is. You know, it's a rule in the GDPR. So, you know, definitely don't sit on it for a day or two, you know, kind of hoping it'll figure itself out. You report it early to whoever needs to know, and that'll hopefully reduce the overall risk.
Well, the good news is we've a very informed bunch, because 89% of people have a data breach policy, which is absolutely excellent. And I know that's a big increase on the last time we've surveyed that. And 24% had a breach in the last 12 months. So just, as you said, just shows how unfortunately common that is. But look, I think the rule of thumb is the DPC will look on you a little bit more leniently if you have the policies and you abide by the timelines. It's when you don't have those that things start to go wrong.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm conscious of time, but one other kind of hot issue that's come across is cookies, which is just proving to be the bane of my life. We spent a long time, as you know, getting our cookie banner right. And I felt that we were all done, all dusted. And then all of a sudden we had to go back and to change the cookie banner again. And every website I go to, more cookies, more cookie banners. What's going on, John?
Yeah. So I suppose the first thing I'd say on this is there's an excellent podcast on the MHC website, goes into it in much more detail than we can do today. So definitely worth digging that out and having a listen to it, because it's a really tricky area and one that's actually really active for regulators at the moment, hence the kind of, resurgence of these cookie banners and things like that. So, we've had the cookie rules for a good while. They also fit, like the electronic marketing, they fit under the e-privacy regime. So when that first came into effect, you seen that sort of old school approach where you had that sort of static banner that said something like, by using this site, you consent to the use of cookies. There might have been a link to a cookie policy. The cookie policy would have talked in very generic terms. Probably it would have said, if you don't want cookies, go and change your browser settings, and that would probably have been it. So a lot of companies would have went down that route. But following GDPR and more particular, I guess, different sweeps by different regulators looking at what companies were doing, that definitely isn't an option anymore. Which is why we've seen a resurgence of these sort of new super banners and that more granular level of consent. So what the regulator wants to see is actual people being able to really exercise consent on it. So it's those drop downs of, yes, I'm happy to have all cookies. No, I want functionality cookies only. I don't want analytics cookies. So it's really getting down into a granular level and giving people a real choice, I suppose. And setting out in detail, what cookies are being set by the website and telling people more information about that. I suppose from a marketing team perspective, it tends to be the biggest thing to look out for is what new processes or software or things like that are you guys going to use that'll generate? Because I guess a lot of the really useful cookies tend to be things like analytics and stuff like that. It's obviously extremely useful for marketing teams. So what I'd say is, like everything with privacy, it's never static. It's always intended to be living. So things like cookies policy and consent banners and things like that, it's not just one thing you do at a point in time and then forget about it. If you're suddenly doing something different, you're getting new Google Analytics cookies or something like that, you need to tell the person internally who has responsibility for that. It could be IT, legal, whoever it is, and it'll be on them. Then they'll go and update it. So what I say is, like, most things in this area are completely doable, but the problems tend to arise when they're either forgotten about or just not managed in the right way.
Well, I'm just looking at the results down here, and it's 61% have actually changed their cookie banner direct results of the DPC guidance. So we're a fairly compliant bunch. I'm probably just going to skip the next question, John, and we might just go straight, if that's okay, to kind of your top 3 takeaways for people, and what's the 3 things they should really watch out for. And then I know we've got 16 questions in, so that's we'll do our best to get through as many of those as we can.
Yeah. So I think, kind of having, the first one would be having a good understanding of what I call the fundamentals, really. So, knowing if you're a controller or a processor, understanding, I guess, these concepts of like data minimization and data accuracy and data retention. And it's just not really understanding them, but thinking how that is going to apply in practice to you, and having some sort of policies around all these different things. That'll definitely help the overall hygiene, I guess, or the health of your databases. The next one would be on the data breaches. Just given the nature of marketing, you just tend to be at that cold face a bit more and dealing with data and sending emails and invites and all that sort of stuff. So, just have an understanding of I guess the type of things that can go wrong and what you do if they do go wrong. Who do you need to talk to internally? As I said, most times it's fine, but you definitely do need to go through that process. And then the last one would be around the cookies. So it's great to see such a high number of people who have looked at it. If you haven't looked at it, I would say definitely get on top of it pretty quickly. It's a very active area. It's something the regulator expects companies now to be on top of and treat it as the kind of living thing that it is. Particularly, I guess a lot of the new cookies will be driven out of a marketing function to some extent. So, just make sure you sort of have a good sense of, if you're using a new tool from one of the technology companies on the website, is that going to set cookies? And if it is, who do you need to tell internally?
Okay, thank you so much. There's a good few questions here, John, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can, and if we're not able to answer them all, we'll try and do a follow-up in the email to the best of our ability. So one question here, a lot of companies decided to re-permission their marketing database. Was that just a once-off for GDPR, or is this something I need to do again?
Yeah, so I guess like a lot of things with GDPR, it was a good time to, I guess, fix bad habits. So in a lot of cases, this was because there was question marks or uncertainty around the integrity of their databases. For example, you could have a really large database, but if you didn't know how 25% of it or the people on it actually got there, then it's very hard to track that back and say, yes, I either have those opt-in consents I need, or I'm fitting within the things like the customer exception or whatever the case may be. So a lot of people who had those question marks at the time decided that actually we just need to take some of that pain now, get a really good database and re-permission it. So hopefully that would have got you a much healthier database at the end of it. But I'd say no, you don't need to be doing that re-permission exercise regularly. I mean, you should have done it, got a fairly healthy database, and as long as you have those good policies and procedures in place, then you'll be able to maintain that. What I'd say on that is, so just going back to that data accuracy and retention points I mentioned earlier on, do kind of maintain that integrity of the database regularly. So things like removing bounce backs, updating details, making sure you have good procedures in place for managing unsubscribes, things like that. So that's really important.
Okay, so if the DPC does come looking, you need to be able to stand over why that person's on your database.
Yeah, exactly.
Legitimate interest, when and how to use it?
Yeah, so legitimate interest, so it's an interesting one. So essentially, when you have a processing activity, so you're using data for a certain purpose, you need to have a legal basis under GDPR. So there's various different ones there. Legitimate interest is a really useful one. It's sometimes a kind of a catch-all for businesses. Some things that cause a lot of people difficulty is you talk about e-privacy rules and opt-ins and things like that, and you're talking about consent, and then you're saying, well, does that mean consent from a GDPR perspective? So we could do another 2 webinars on all of that stuff. But I suppose legitimate interest, I think I'd view it as a kind of the sort of the catch-all processing ground. You're using it, where the others don't really fit. It's much more of a balancing exercise. So effectively, you're saying, I'm doing this processing activity because it's in the legitimate interests of the business to do it, but you need to balance that against the impact it has on the individuals. One thing I would say is, if you're relying on legitimate interests, just be careful around any of those special category data, because you can't use it for the things like health information and things like that.
Okay, so it's not a golden ticket.
No, absolutely not. But very useful if you use it the right way.
There's a good few questions now coming in, so I'm going to try and combine them, a couple of them together, around when you're dealing with third parties. So if you're dealing with someone, they have your data, they have a breach, or you're sharing your data with that third party, is there kind of a best practice? So that kind of the whole third party piece seems to be creating a good few questions here.
Yeah, and that can cause a lot of concern, I guess, around, as you said, the data breaches. So I guess there's lots of different ways data can kind of flow between organizations. So it goes back to my point around, understanding if you're a controller or a processor. That extends to who are you sharing data with? Are they controllers or are they processors? The most common scenario is that they're processors. So your CRM provider, if it's cloud-based and they notify you and say, hey, we had a database, or we had a breach, we think somebody may have been able to access the systems, we're not sure, they're going to be your processor. So I mean, ultimately in that scenario, you as the controller, I mean, the buck stops with you. You're responsible for compliance. So you can, you might be annoyed that this happened, but you sort of can't say, well, I'll let them deal with it and go and talk to the regulator. They're acting on your instructions. You're expected to oversee what they're doing and be on top of what they're doing. So in that scenario, that's very much your issue as much as it is theirs. There might be situations where you're sharing information on a more of a controller to controller type basis. So you have two organizations and each of them are data controllers. Sometimes it might happen in like group scenarios and things like that. There's less of a clear link there, so you may still kind of get dragged into whatever happens depending on the facts of it, but much less so, as in they're sort of responsible for their own activities. There is another category called joint controllership, and that's sort of where your two organizations are effectively working towards a common purpose, or making, they're kind of that joint decision making around what's being collected and what it's being used for. There you're kind of viewed very much together. So if one suffers a data breach, it involves the other. Conscious that we're kind of getting into areas we didn't necessarily cover. But yeah, I suppose the takeaway on that is anytime you're sharing information or giving information to a third party, even within a sort of a group organization, just understand what that data flow is. And I guess from a marketing perspective, if you're kind of onboarding new suppliers and things like that, make sure you update, whether it's the internal legal team or whoever it is that manages this, so that they know what these relationships, and they can kind of put in place the protections and policies that they need.
Okay, no, I know, John, we've covered a lot of issues at a very top level, and I'm conscious that most of these require a full webinar in themselves, so thank you for that. There's another question here which I think is quite interesting. Transactional versus marketing messages. What constitutes a transactional message?
So I assume what's meant there is sort of day-to-day kind of related to you've bought a product or something like that. Classic scenario is you're in a shop and somebody says, "Can I have your email address? I want to email you a copy of the receipt." So I assume that's what's being meant at there in terms of transactional. So it can be really blurred. It's something regulators are really alive to, of I suppose companies doing sneaky marketing within those sort of transactional sort of messages, particularly something like an e-receipt or something like that. So what I'd say is, look, if it looks like marketing dressed up as something else, it probably is marketing. If you're doing that kind of more transactional or functional messaging, that's really what it should be. You shouldn't be sort of sticking in, hey, we've great special offers on X, Y, and Z down at the bottom of it, because you're straying very close to marketing there. And it's something regulators are absolutely alive to, and they have been for years. So not too much to get past them on that. Okay,
so if it quacks like a duck and it waddles like a duck, it's marketing. marketing duck.
Exactly.
One other question, I think this is probably going to be our last one, but there's some good questions here. So we're probably going to do a series of vlogs and podcasts. Just keep an eye out, because there's some good questions here. But I did think this one was quite nice, and sorry to catch you on the hop, but other types of online marketing. So things like apps, advertising and direct marketing, push notifications in apps. Any kind of legal kind of pitfalls there?
Yeah, so I suppose it's broadly the same rules that apply. Now, sometimes with like in-app, push notifications and things like that, you're effectively managing some of the sort of opt-ins and things like that, because that's the functionality of apps, and you have to give permissions for things like that. But broadly, it's the same principles apply. So now if you're looking to market via WhatsApp or something like that, it's electronic marketing. Now, depending on the nature of, if it's like your own kind of app and you want to push out notifications and things like that, it's still the same rules, but it just, I guess, a bit more tied into the app functionality.
Okay, John, thanks again for your time. We really appreciate everyone dialing in. We hope we've been able to answer some of your questions.